I don't have the speakerphone on. Yeah, good morning. This is Pastor Thomas from the Church of the Living God in Sacramento, California. I would like to welcome you to our service this morning, which of course is being live streamed. If you know someone who might be interested in seeing the service or being part of it, have them go to churchofthelivingGod.net. Simply key in on whatever device you have, churchofthelivingGod.net. We have for you this morning a text from the book of Matthew. Actually, we are going to use two texts this morning, two scriptures. First, Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, and then Acts chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Once again, that is Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, and Acts chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Beginning with Matthew chapter 19, verse 26, and it reads, "But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Our text here from Matthew chapter 19, verse 26 reads, "But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." We want to keep that in mind, that scripture thought in mind as we proceed forward. When we turn to the book of Acts, the second chapter, and we look at verses 8 through 11, and we have a story here which we want to use because this is going to be part of our message today in terms of one of the main points we want to make today. And so reading from Acts, the second chapter, beginning with verse 8, and I'm going to read through verse 11. Verse 8 reads, "And how hear we every man in our own tongue, wherein we were born, Parthians and Medes and Amalekites and the dwellers in Mesopotamia and in Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia in Egypt, and in the parts of Libya about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Arabians, we do hear them speak in our tongues the wonderful works of God." Concept there being is why these men were from various parts of the known earth at that time and naturally spoke their native language, which would not have been Hebrew. But yet we see that they all understood each other. They were able to communicate. They were talking about the same thing. They were undergoing the same experience. They were experiencing the same thing. So we want to keep that in mind. So we have our text, we have Matthew 19 and 26, which says, "Now with men this is not possible, but with God all things are possible." And then we see here in Acts, we see something very magnificent, something very powerful happening where people around the world speaking in one voice. We have a subject for you today, or a title, the God factor. The God factor. Very importantly that we be aware at all times as we go about carrying out our Christian duties or our earthly affairs, that we keep in mind that there is such a thing as the God factor, that God is real. God will have his input. We might be able to shut somebody else out. Not uncommonly, as we go about putting together plans, as we go about building our structures, as we go about our daily business, not uncommonly do we not consider the God factor. But we need to keep in mind what Matthew said now. He said, for with men some things are not possible, but with God all things are possible. Another way of putting it, some things that we cannot get done operating within our own strength, under our own power, can be accomplished through the power of God. And so this is one reason why when we saw in Acts, when we saw people from various parts of the world, a lot of them, when I read that, we saw that we were talking about people from a lot of different walks, a lot of different parts of the world. People who spoke different languages could understand each other, and when one spoke, the other one, even though he was from another side of the world, could say, right on, brother. That's God. That can only be accomplished through the power of God. If you speak French, and I only speak English, and this man speaks Spanish, but he can't understand French, but yet we all understand each other, that has to be God. In this case, the Holy Spirit. First Pentecost. So in looking at this subject, this title, the God factor, when I was looking at this, I thought about sometimes when God has revealed himself in my life, and in some instances when he has helped me out. And sometimes it wasn't a real big thing. See, God doesn't only intervene in our lives and intervenes in the affairs of men in some kind of big old magnificent mighty way. Sometimes it can be kind of small when the God factor will kick in and help us achieve something that we were having a difficult time achieving. It doesn't have to be some kind of big thing. An example from my own life. I remember when I was a manager with Child Protective Service, and we got a new director when I was about 3 years away from getting ready to retire. And I had a, as one might say, a fairly upbeat, non-problematic tenure as a manager. During that 25 plus years that I worked for CPS, I had been a manager for about 12 years. And for the most part, it had been a fairly easy ride. But we got a new CEO who for whatever reason, he and I didn't really see eye to eye. Now, I don't know if anyone in here has ever been in that situation where you didn't see eye to eye with your boss. Oh, I wish I had some help. But nevertheless, I'm 3 years away from my retirement. I have 3 years left. And here I am faced with a manager, with a boss who I'm not his favorite, to say the least. But nevertheless, so what he did, he implemented a policy because he wanted to bring about change, which certainly was his prerogative and is normal in the corporate world as well as in government. So the new CEO comes in and he says, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to start having my team, my management team, meet at 7 a.m. every morning. Well, we had been used to meeting once a week at 1:30 p.m. But the new manager came in and said immediately, this is one of the first things I'm going to do, is we're going to have morning briefings where each manager is going to be briefed by me before we set out to conquer the day. Well, that imposed a lot of problems for a lot of people because many of the managers, some of them were females, some of them were males who had young kids that they had to get off to school first before they could come to work. And so it was not uncommon for a manager to not be able to get there at 7 under ordinary circumstances. But now we're faced with a situation where across the board, if you are a manager, you are to be at that meeting at 7 a.m. And during the meeting, what he did, he assigned each manager a turn a morning when he was to present, or she was to present on what they were doing, what kind of success they were having with their individual program, what was their vision for their area of responsibility, and just in general bring people aboard, bring people up to date on what they were doing. And this needed to be done in a professional way. And most of the managers were using PowerPoint. That this was something that you had to put a lot of time and work in. But to get to the point, I was moonlighting in addition to doing my regular job. And I was moonlighting out of town. So I was building my consulting business because I'm preparing to retire in 3 years. I wish I had somebody. So my side business took me out of county. And this one particular time when the manager, the CEO had said to me, okay, Thomas, you're gonna bring the presentation tomorrow, and it happened to be on a Friday. He said, that's gonna be on you. Now, me and this guy had already had some interaction that was not all that, it wasn't pro Thomas or Bob. It was, we had stated a few things. Well, we had disagreed before that, but we were still kind of working it out. But nevertheless, he said, you're going to present on Friday morning at 7 p.m. Well, I had to go out of town that Thursday night. I had to go to San Joaquin County. And I had gone down and I had counseled some kids in a facility. And when I was getting ready to leave, and it was about maybe 9 o'clock at night, somewhere in there, when I was getting ready to leave, my car wouldn't start. At that time, I had a 74 Mercedes, a D-Class, and the thing wouldn't start. And so there was another work staff person there. It was just me and him. He said, well, you know, I'm pretty good at working on cars. Let me see if I can get it started. So he tried to jump it. He had jumper cables, still wouldn't start. Nothing he did, we couldn't get it started. But he said he had a battery tester. He tested it, and he said, I'm pretty sure it's your battery, but the cells are so bad in it, I can't jump it. So I said, okay, well, what I have to do, I have to buy a new battery. So I got on the phone, the house phone. This was before we had cell phones. And I called Cragen. At that time, that was before Cragen had bought out, before O'Reilly had bought out Cragen. So I called Cragen, and a man answered the phone. Now, we're talking about how sometimes God intervenes in ways that are kind of small. It's not always coming in and curing cancer, or it's not always coming in and getting you a new house, coming in and extending your life 15 years like he did Hezekiah. Those are good things. But sometimes it is something kind of small. But now this was big to me because I needed to first drive all the way from Stockton back to Sacramento and then put together my presentation. And then be at work at least about a half hour early to set everything up. So this was a big deal for me, even though it might have been small for someone else, or in comparison to what someone else might needed God to do. But nevertheless, I called Cragen, and a man answered, and I told him what I was looking for. I said, I'm looking for a battery for a Mercedes 240D, 1974 model. He said, okay. He went back in the area of the store where the batteries were kept, and he wasn't gone very long. He came right back and said, we don't have one. I said, you don't have one? I said, wow. And he said, plus we're getting ready to close, and we don't have one. So I said, wow, what am I going to do now? So we went back out. We tried to get it to start. It wouldn't start. So something moved in my spirit that said, call them again. I called Cragen again, and a female answered. Oh, I'm not going to get her to help. I wish I had some help. This time, a female answered, and I told her my circumstance. I didn't just tell her I was looking for a battery. I said, I got to have a battery. She said, well, let me check. She went back, and she stayed a long time. And she came back and said, we have one. She said it was in the storeroom. She said, I didn't just check the shelf. She said, I checked back in the storeroom and I found one. We have exactly what you need. She said, but we're getting ready to close. I said, Well, hey, I really need it. She said, how long will it take you to get here? And I didn't really know Stockton that well, but the staff person said, I know that area like I know the palm of my hand. And he said, I'll go get it for you. And he said, I can go over there and get it. So you'll be riding around all night trying to find a car. Once again, this was back before GPS. We didn't have cell phones and we didn't have a GPS system. But this staff person said, I can go get that and be back here way sooner than you could. He said, I know shortcuts. I was born and raised right here in Stockton. Don't tell me there are not some good people living in Stockton. And he did that. And when he went over and picked it up, he got it and brought it back. And what he had told me, he said, while I'm gone, you go ahead and take out the old battery. And he said, the man who was working for Mr. Carter, he said, here's his toolkit. You can find what you need in there. He had a toolbox. While he was gone, I looked in the toolbox because what I needed was a 1/4-inch wrench. I looked in the toolbox, no 1/4-inch. I found a 1/8, I found 1/16, I found a 1/2 inch, but I could not find a 1/4-inch. I said, wow, what am I doing? I tried to call the staff person to tell him, buy a 1/4-inch wrench, and I'm gonna give you the money when you get back. But I couldn't reach him. He had already left the store. So he pulls up and he said, hey, you got the old battery? I said, hey man, I looked, I couldn't loosen the cables, man. I couldn't even loosen them so I could slide the thing off. He said, wow. So we looked around the garage and he said, I just can't believe that this man doesn't have a 1/4-inch wrench. So we looked around and I looked all over the garage. And then I looked under my rear passenger side tire and there was a wrench under that. And so I went around on the other side and I worked it loose, pulled it loose, and I looked at it. It was a 1/4 inch. We got the battery out, put the new one in. I got home about 11 o'clock. I put together my presentation, and I literally tore the roof off the place. Because I knew what God had done for me. I knew about the God factor. Under my own power, I could not have done it. I could not have gotten the battery. And I know that woman that I talked to was an angel. The one that I talked to the second time was an angel. And I know it was the hand of God that put that wrench there. I don't care what nobody says. You don't tell me what God won't do. But then I told my daughter that, and she heard me, and this is going to be a 2-part sermon. She heard me tell that once when I was talking to some folk about what God would do. And when I finished, she said, Dad, that ain't nothing. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, let me tell you what happened to me. When she was in high school, we bought her a used car. I forget what kind it was, an Accord, a Honda Accord. And she had gone somewhere at night. And when she was driving back, her car broke down. She was able to get it off. I believe she was on the freeway. She was able to get it off the actual freeway over onto the side, and it was foggy. And here's a young girl out there by herself. She too, this was before the cell phone, before it was coming. A few people had them, but not everybody. This was when cell phones they were not readily in the hands of everybody. She didn't have a cell phone. So she said, what am I going to do? And she said, as she was wondering what she was going to do, cars coming by, no one stopped. Cars coming by, no one stopped. And finally, a truck comes up behind her and stops. And there was a middle-aged African-American man driving the truck. And she told him what the deal was, that a car had broken down and it wouldn't start. He couldn't start it. But the kind of truck it was a tow truck. You asked her where she lived. This happened out in the North area. And at that time, we lived in Green Haven. She told him, it's late now. It's late. What he did, he got back in his truck, put it around in front of her, hooked up his towing system, and towed her all the way home. See, that's God. Didn't charge her nothing. Didn't try to molest her or anything. And I see why she said, when she compared what God had done for me with what God had done for her, I could see why she said, hey, Dad, that ain't nothing when I look at what God did for me. But I want to tell you that there is such a thing as God taking over when we get to a point where we can't go any further, where we have run out of earthly options. God picks up, the God factor. Now let's look at some cases very quickly, because God didn't just start bailing us out, or God didn't just start helping man out when he helped me out. We have a person by the name of Joshua. Y'all know about him. Well, Joshua was charged with defeating some folk that had been a problem for a long time for God. And in the land of Canaan, there were some folk who were very, very wicked and had engaged in all manner of ungodly behavior. And Joshua had to go against them, because keeping in mind, Joshua's main charge, or we might say why God raised Joshua up, it was to finish what Moses had started. And Moses had been called earlier to lead God's people to the promised land from up out of slavery in Egypt. But Moses hadn't been able to do that for various reasons, primarily because of lack of faith on the part of the folk following Moses. Not that Moses himself did not have faith, but the folk following Moses did not have the faith to go into the promised land, to conquer the land. So after Moses passed, then Joshua, who had been an understudy of Moses, his job was to finish what God had charged his people with doing. So we're going to read a little bit here about this man. Moses had turned this over to Joshua to finish what God had started through him. So we go to Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10, and specifically we are going to look at verses 11 through 13. That's Joshua chapter 10, verses 11 through 13. I'm talking about the God factor. Folk, there is a God factor. And I urge you, I plead with you to hold that in memory. And as you walk the earth, as you go about your earthly affairs, keep in mind that there is help available. There's a God factor that can bust through walls, that can clear territory that you might otherwise not be able to do, that can tear down doors. Oh, I know that's right. So we see here Joshua chapter 10, and when we get to verse 11, it reads, I'm reading from Joshua chapter 10, beginning with verse 11, and it reads, and it came to pass, and this is talking about a battle that was taking place between the children of Israel being led by Joshua, and they were going against another nation, some descendants here really of probably Esau or Lot or somebody like that. These folk, even though they were enemies, they were distant relatives that were occupying this land. But what we have here, chapter 10, verse 11 says, and it came to pass as they fled from before Israel. What the picture here is saying, that it came a point in the battle where Joshua had the enemy on the run. You got it? Where the battle was raging and Joshua was winning. He had him on the run. Oh, I wish I had somebody. So verse 11 says, and it came to pass as they fled from before Israel. Israel meaning the children of God, the folk who were being led by Joshua. And were in the going down to Bet Horon. So these folk were running. Joshua had them on the run. And then it says, the Lord got involved in it. And it said here, the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon these people as Joshua was pursuing them. The Lord said, hey, well, let me help you out here. And it says here, the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them, Azekah and they died. So the Lord got in the battle on Joshua's side, and not only was Joshua chasing them with the spear and perhaps the bow and arrow, God started throwing big ice stones down from heaven on them and killed more of them than Joshua did. It's the God factor kicked in. And then it says here, continuing to read verse 11, it says, they were more which died with hailstones. He got big ice stones, stones of ice that God put together and threw down on Joshua's enemy. I want to tell you that God will throw down big stones on your enemies.
Yes, he will. Yes, he will.
It said there were more which died from the hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew. That when God threw down those big ice stones, more of the enemy went down than it did that Joshua was able to catch up with and slay. But as we read, that's not the only time the God factor kicked in during this particular battle. When we read this further, verse 12, it says, then spoke Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel, when the Lord enabled them to defeat the Amorites, to overcome the Amorites, to take the Amorites out. Okay, and then it says here, then spoke Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites from before the children of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel. Yeah. All right, we see here that Joshua was still at battle. They are still at war with their enemies. And we see Joshua doing this. It says, and Joshua said in the sight of Israel. What he did, he said in sight of the other men on his side, the men he was leading, watch this. He said, watch this. Starting to get dark here. And I need some help. I need God again. I need the God factor. It is starting to get dark and we're not through yet. I need some time. That I got these guys where I want them, but the sun is starting to go down. I need more time. Oh, hell nobody. And he said, son, S-U-N, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. Stand still. See, Joshua was a man of God. Joshua believed. Joshua had already seen God throw down big stones of ice on his enemy, but he still needed some help. He still needed some time. He needed to stop the sun from going down so he could finish what he had started. And he called out to the Lord. And verse 18 says, and the sun stood still. The power of God, the God factor, that Joshua called out to the sun, stand still, and God made it stand still. He did not let the sun go down on his children.
All right.
God won't let the sun set on you.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you.
13 says, and the sun stood still. And the moon stayed. The moon's coming up on this side, trying to push the sun off the sun's. My boy still got work to do. He needs some light. It said, and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies.
Amen.
The God factor. And it gave time. The sun stood still. It stopped and provided light. In Vietnam, we had these flares. See, that when we suspected there was enemy out there trying to attack the base, we could shoot a flare and it would light up where you could, but the problem is it didn't last that long. And the Viet Cong knew that. So you shoot a flare, boom, maybe 30 seconds or something. But see, when God held the sun, the big old sun, on Joshua's problem, it didn't go out. It stayed until he was finished. And that's what the God factor, it won't just give you a little something and then leave. It stayed until he finished. But that's not, and we're running out of time here for today, but that's not the only time that we see when we look in Scripture where the God factor kicked in, and kicked in a major way. Let's look at one more today, and then we're done. Oh, the book of Exodus. Ooh-wee. See God at work. When I see what God did in the book of Exodus, it just makes me, I just have to shout. I just have to shout. When I look at the God factor and how God helped Moses, time and time again. No, God has pulled no one out of a tough spot more so than he did Moses. I don't care what you say. Time and time again, the God factor kicked in and changed the outcome in Moses' favor. Let's look at this. Chapter 14, verse 21. Now, this is a story we're familiar with. This was a case where God's children were being vastly pursued by the enemy, by the Egyptians through Ramsey, Pharaoh. And it was more than they could handle. The enemy was big, because at that time, Egypt, in comparison to the other countries in the world, was like the United States of America in comparison to the other countries in the world. It was big dog. Egypt had the most fierce, treacherous, deadly military on the globe. So many chariots, you couldn't count them, and war horses. The most powerful military on the earth were chasing God's children and pinning them between themselves and the Red Sea. God's children, being led by Moses, found himself and his children pinned between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's awesome army.
Yes.
And they were unarmed. Moses' folk were unarmed. They had no weapons to speak of because they had just gotten out of slavery. They had no military training, even though Moses himself was a great warrior. But the people following him, it was like a colony of lambs being led by a lion. But the vast majority of the folk following, all they could do was run. That's all they knew to do. And we see here, Pharaoh's army has chased them, has pursued them all the way to the banks of the Red Sea, and they are pinned. It's kind of like in chess, where I pin your king. He has no moves. I surround him. He can't go backwards, he can't go forward, and he can't go sideways. This is the situation that Moses saw himself in. But Moses knew one thing. He knew the Lord. And he knew about the God factor. He knew what he couldn't do, God could.
Come on.
And so we have this story, verse 21. We're reading from chapter 14 of the book of Exodus, which captures this story. One of the most powerful, awesome display of God's power that you ever see. And 21 say, and Moses, he's pinned. He has no more moves, no more earthly moves. There's nothing else he can do. He can't run because the Red Sea is right behind him. And it's too wide to cross. So we got volume here. And so, but 21 says, and Moses, we could say, and Moses knowing the power of God, Moses knowing what God had done for him previously, knowing the way God had equipped him, it said here, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, And what happened? The Lord caused the sea to go back. God backed up the sea. Oh, I wish I had somebody. It said, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea. We could say the God factor kicked in. See, the title of the sermon is the God factor. See, we need the God factor. Don't let anybody tell you you don't need the God factor, because sometimes we find ourselves pinned. Don't you know? Whatever bank or savings union that holds the mortgage to your house can pin you. And they ain't the only one can pin you. There are folk in this pandemic been pinned, lost their jobs, can't pay. Common everyday thing, can't pay the phone bill. Forget about cable. They've been lost that. Can't pay the air conditioning. Yeah, PG&E will work with you for a while, and they'll waive it for a while, but they won't waive it forever. They'll roll with you a little while, but see, God will roll with you a long while. We see here, it said, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind. How many know that God controls the wind and can make the wind do whatever it wants to do? We saw that in the New Testament where Jesus spoke to the wind on the Sea of Galilee, and he told the wind, peace be still. And the wind stopped all that raging. And we see here, it said, and a strong east wind all that night. God didn't just hit it a little bit and say, okay, if you don't get in here real fast right now, then, I'm going to let the water back on you. It said all that night, it said, and made the sea dry land. He didn't just take it halfway where he drew up a lot of the water. See, if somebody like me helping you, I might come and I might remove some of the water. That's what man will do. But it said here in the text, if you got that, it said that all that night God worked on it and made the sea dry land. You didn't get your sandals all muddy and get mud all between your toes when you walked on it. It said, and the waters were divided. And 22 says, and the children, and I'm reading from the 14th chapter of Exodus, verse 22. We're talking about this, the God factor kicking in, where after Moses, who was leading the Israelites, after he had gotten pinned, where he had no other moves. He had run out of moves. No other earthly options. That's what we're reading about here. We're reading about the God factor. We're reading about what God did. Moses had done all he could do. Got too big for Moses. And 22 says, and when we finish this, we're done for today. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea up on the dry ground. See, the reason why I emphasize dry ground, what the writer here, what Moses wants us to know, is that God didn't just take him part of the way. God didn't do nothing quick and dirty. It still left some water. It still left it all muddy. And then when the chariots started to chase them, they wouldn't be able to run because, it's muddy and you can't run that fast in mud. No. He did it right. When God does something, he does it completely. He does it well. He takes care of his children well. God is a good provider.
Yes, he is.
And he said they walked across on dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. And if we were to read that, we would see, if we continued reading, we would see when the Egyptians, when their enemies got in the water and saw that it was dry and there was a road through, when they went in, God closed it back up when they got in the middle. The God factor. We'll pick this up and finish this up another day. We're talking about the God factor. And I just want to say once again, keep that in mind, that that's there for you. Amen. Amen.
I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. He watches me. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches. I know he watches. I know he watches me. I sing because I'm happy. I sing because